The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
1 week ago today, I said I had no idea when the next solo pod would be. Well, it was 1 week in the future. Because once again, I have screwed the poor Ethan Noroff out of an opportunity to get on a Monday show. My weekend was madness. I don't know about you guys. Madness. Wifey is out of town for a week. So I am rocking solo. And then Sunday, yesterday, I thought that I was going to have some assistance with childcare. I had set it up to hang out with potentially multiple grandparents. And then grandparent number one had to call out because our dog got stung by a bee and had to go into the hospital, which, petrifying. They didn't know that's what it was at first. Dog was, like, freaking out and having seizures, and then remove the stinger, get some Benadryl in that thing. Dog is better. So that's good news, but it also meant that my midday was now wiped out. And then the afternoon and evening, the expectation was hanging out and then also doing dinner with another grandparent. And that grandparent had a cold, so that had to get canceled. So all the times on Sunday where I could have potentially recorded with our good buddy Ethan, poof, right out the window. So I'll make sure he gets onto a pod later this week, possibly with Neil as well. You are stuck with me today because of all of that. That means that I actually have to record first thing on Monday morning. And Ethan, like a normal person, has a job. Starts Monday morning. He's got to go in and teach some kids, shape the future. Future of Southern California. Future of America. So apologies to Ethan. Apologies to all of you, who I'm sure we're looking forward to hearing from the great Ethan Noroff on today's podcast. You are instead stuck with me, which means it is the continuing saga of our deep... Someone on, I forget who, and I'm sure you'll remind me on Twitter because I didn't give proper credit here, but someone on Twitter called him Danalytics. And I liked that a lot, and I should have written down who actually coined the term. It was one of you fine folks. Danalytics. We'll pick up where we left off last Monday. First things first, welcome to Fantasy NBA Today. I'm Dan Besbris, at Dan Besbris on Twitter. This is a Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee and Hoop Ball presentation. HawaiianIsles.com is the website. At HI Kona Coffee on Twitter. Hawaiian Isles on Amazon.com. If you'd like to order that bad boy Prime. I like to try to take some time at least once a week talking about Hawaiian Isles just to thank them again for partnering with us as our title sponsor of all podcasts here at Hoop Ball. All audio-visual, anything that comes your way is thanks to Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee Company. But also, just taking a moment to sort of glance at what they got going on. And no specials running right now at this exact moment, but what I would strongly recommend is going to HawaiianIsles.com and clicking on that left nav bar. There's a little, you know how that works. You click on the little three lines, and then the navigation bar bops down. And you've got all these things. You can view all flavors. That's my favorite button to hit. They've got a mix and match pack. They've got vanilla macadamia, sunrise, the classic. And they start at about $11 on the website. You can actually get them around that same price and then Prime on Amazon. It's that $11 price tag, by the way, is includes shipping as well. So if you're worried about some sort of discrepancy there, it's fantastic. Just go look at the website and tell me if you can stop yourself from buying something. Everything's so pretty. Hawaii, man. We all got to go. Forget the coffee for a minute. We just all got to go to Hawaii. Let's go visit the shop. Let's go visit Glenn. So, again, thank you to Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee Company, HawaiianIsles.com. Check them out right now. And Hoop Ball, of course. Hoop-ball.com, at Hoopball Fantasy, at Hoopball Tweets, all that good stuff. It's the week beginning, right? It's Monday morning, so we're going to jam in all our logistical stuff. Tomorrow, Neil Rochlani will co-host. I'm not going to say join me. That's not right anymore. He's a host of this podcast. Neil and myself will host a betting day. We'll get into betting stuff. We'll talk about series prices, how that's all shaking out as we've tried to sort of game out how the different series are going and where we went wrong last week. We might even also get into some of the things that we were tracking over the course of this season, although we don't have the results of all of that yet. Got to tabulate. And we'll talk a little bit about projects that Neil's got kind of quietly working on behind the scenes. He is an Excel spreadsheet wizard. Wednesday, we'll talk to Brandon Marcus. We'll do some more lessons learned from a season gone by. Last week, we talked about drafting healthy rosters and what a simple concept that is, but one that is wildly underutilized in fantasy sports circles. Thursday, hopefully it'll be Neil and Ethan. Friday, Adrian and Coach. That'll wrap up your week here on Fantasy NBA Today. So that's what's coming up over the next 5 including today, days on this podcast. All right, we're about 5 minutes into this thing, so that's plenty of week starting logistical crap. And I say crap because, not because I don't like it, but because you guys don't really care. I think it's just nice to know what's coming. Last week, Monday, Danalytics show, we got into the comparison between pre-rank and final rank. Basically, as we tabulate them on Yahoo. That's the site we've been using. I just want to do a quick recap here. Not necessarily for those that are tuning in for the first time, because I don't think that there are many of you on May 6th that listening to your first podcast. But really, just for those that even listened last week and kind of forgot where we left off. Lucky for you, I also forgot where we left off. So I went back and I listened to last Monday's podcast, first thing this morning. And I remembered what we had gotten to. We left off basically, and don't worry, I'll go back and I'll do a little bit more of a recap. We left off basically looking at the live absolute value average, and I know, we'll go back, don't worry, of the difference between pre-rank and final rank on Yahoo, 9cat. One thing that I also said last week was that I wanted to add a running per 10 marker on the absolute value stuff. I've done that as well. The categories that we went over last week, I'm not going to do a full 20-minute reprofile of these things, but you start rank, final rank. Those are pretty easy ones to understand. The average difference, we'll get to that in a second. The average final rank over the last 5 picks, meaning, well, what is the actual final average close to? And you want that to be somewhere near the start rank. The difference between the final and start rank, the absolute value of the difference between the start and final rank, which, of course, is just the positive version of whatever the difference might be. Whether it's above or below, it's going to give you a positive number. The live running sum of the difference, the live absolute value sum of the difference. It would actually be the live sum absolute value because anyway, it doesn't matter. The live average of the difference, the live absolute value average, and then a per 10 total on each one of those two numbers. The reason that I like to focus on the per 10, and this is where we're going to pick up from last week, is that it gives you not only an indicator of where things are sitting, but it also gives you an indicator of whether or not there are any lesser fluctuations. It's almost like a way to tamp down the wild fluctuations in the average. The average is almost always going to go up. Almost always. Not always. I mean, it'll go down a little bit if you have one that's relatively close to the start ranking. And that'll actually bring the absolute value average down, or the live average. Well, that one's tough to know because you kind of need a positive number to bring that number down. I tried to jump over a few things, guys, but I really think I got to go farther back on this thing. Okay, let's take a moment here and kind of rehash a few markers, just so we really have a better idea of where we left off. Okay, the reason that we have these per 10s again, and this is, we're doing a little bit of a refresh here. The per 10s is not a per 10 on the average. It's a per 10 on the difference. And the absolute value per 10 is a per 10 on the absolute value of the difference. All right? So the averages totals, the running averages and the running sums, those are different categories. Does that make sense? That's why I wanted to go back a little bit here. So the live sum just adds up the difference between every start and final rank. The live absolute value of the sum takes the absolute value of each difference and adds those up. The running average of the live sum divides whatever that live sum is by however many picks there have been. So, Kemba Walker was number 15. The live sum at that point was negative 125. We're dividing 125 by 15, and you get negative 8.33. Likewise, for that same thing, the absolute value of all of the differences added together is 157. You divide that by 15, you get 10.47. So that's the running live average and the running absolute value live average. What does that tell you? Well, that tells you that by that point, the average miss size is negative 8.33. And the absolute value number tells you that the average just total miss in any direction is 10.47, meaning even the ones that kept the negative to be a little bit of a smaller negative were misses in the positive direction. It wasn't as though they were spot on. This is why I really like the per 10. The per 10 tells us how things are generally going over a one-round period. The per 10 of the difference at Kemba Walker's spot is negative 12.2. So basically what that's saying now, because the number is negative 8.33, that's just a running average, and the per 10 is negative 12.2, that has basically pulled out the first 4 to 5 picks. It'll be the first 5 picks in this regard, which were really freaking close. So at Kemba Walker, you're saying, oh, well, negative 8.33. Maybe I should venture as far as 8.33 down the chart, or even the absolute value. It says negative or 10.47. Okay, let's go one farther. And this is the thing I said I wanted to add in last week. The absolute value per 10, meaning the absolute value or the absolute value difference, all added together, of each difference added together, and then over the last 10 picks is 15.2. 15.2. This is at the 15th pick. Meaning that once you wipe out the first 5 picks, things peter off pretty quick. Why would we track the per 10? Why would we track the per 10, particularly on this absolute value side? What is this telling us that the other ones are not? The beauty of the absolute value per 10 that isn't, or that is, I should say, expressed in this category, that is not expressed in just a traditional running live average, is that outliers go away after 10 picks. They're no longer in that. Right? Because once you get to, like, for example, pick 50, okay, that's a bad one because that contains both Gary Harris and Will Barton over the last 10 picks. That's a bad place to start. Here's a good place to start. Pick 32 is Klay Thompson. Pick 33 is Tobias Harris. The absolute value over the last 10 difference, and you could do it with just the regular one. You don't even need to do the absolute value because actually both reflect it in a certain capacity, is 20.2. Meaning that over the last 10 picks, from picks 23 to 32, pre-ranks, I should say, over that 10-pick span, the average miss size is 20. That's the average miss size. It's pretty remarkable, isn't it? And that boggles the mind. Now, obviously, that includes John Wall, and this is why this is interesting. John Wall was a massive miss. He was a negative 50. Chris Middleton was a negative 44. Draymond Green was a negative 33. Those are the big misses in the negative direction over that span. There really aren't that many big misses in the positive direction from 23 3 to 32. The reason I'm picking this is because it illustrates one of the reasons that the per 10 is interesting. If you go to the next per 10, meaning 24 to 33 from Kyle Lowry to Tobias Harris, the average miss size is 15.2. So it actually dropped by 5 and actually hangs out in that area for the better part of the next, 13 picks or so. You know what doesn't reflect that? The average and the absolute value of the average. Those numbers basically just keep going up the whole time. If you look at where John Wall creeps in, over the last 10, that becomes an 18. And when he disappears, it goes from a 20 down to a 15. If you look at the non-per 10, meaning the running average of every pick to that point, John Wall's big miss is always in there. So one whopper of a miss from the early third round is going to cloud numbers from a round and a half, 2 rounds, 3 rounds, whatever you want it to be later. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it turns out that that's just part of the system. But to me, when I look at John Wall, and now we'll just look at the absolute value average at that point. It jumps, Jimmy Butler was 10.5, and then John Wall jumps it to 12. And by the end of John Wall, as we talked about before, it's actually still at 13.5, so it doesn't move all that much. When it comes back to Tobias Harris, it goes from 13.5 to 13.1. That is a very small and almost imperceptible difference. So if you're looking at the running absolute value average of every pick to each point, that number always very slowly goes up. The ups and downs are very small. You almost can't find them. You can find the big jumps when something terrible happens. But when you got a couple of good picks in there, it doesn't jump out at you. So what that now tells us is that once John Wall is logged into the system, he's never coming out. And there's a stretch there where you're like, okay, well, I should be able to venture as much as a round and a half away. Basically, we're going to go in groups of 10. So 12 picks to 13 picks away over that next 10 group. And then it stays at 13 for another 9 picks after that. It doesn't tell us anything. 8 picks after that. I was close. I was eyeballing it, and then I counted. From John Wall all the way to basically Gary Harris, if you're just looking at the average, because that's the one that actually tamps down the results, it creates a much more conservative number. It's telling you that you should only venture 12 to 14 picks away from the pre-ranking. And it never really fluctuates. It's 12 for 1, 2, 3 spots, and then it's 13 for, basically the whole way through. And then it's 14 for the last 2 or 3. We could even just round it and say, it basically says you should be about 13 picks away for, how many slots did I just select? 20? I think I picked 20 spots. And for 20 whole spots, it's saying, you should be back exactly 13 picks away. If you go over the last 10, which now remember, when John Wall gets included, obviously, that's a number that's going to jump up a little bit. But after he's no longer included, that number drops back down. So it would almost be better to go, if you wanted to see really fast fluctuations, you could even go over the last 5. Let's see what happens if we do that instead. Let's change 10 to 5 and see how these numbers change based almost exclusively on John Wall. The answer is, when Wall pops in, the change is from 6.6 at Jimmy Butler to 15 at John Wall. But here's the beauty part. John Wall now comes out of the system by C.J. McCollum at number 28. The fluctuations get pretty wild, by the way. And this is why it's good to have both the severe example and also the tamped down conservative example. You put those two things together, and you get the information that you're looking for. Here's what we get when we put that info together. We already talked about the running average, which tells you, again, this creates a much more linear line from 0 to 100 of how far away the picks are on average. That line goes from 1 to 35 over a pretty linear stretch. There's a couple of little tiny jumps in there, but most of them are almost imperceptible when you think about how it's going, about a third of a point per spot. Now, if you look at the every 5 of that instead of the entire total of it, well, let's see it. Russell Westbrook, it's 9. By the time you get to Ben Simmons, it's 24. When you get to Drew Holiday at the end of the round, it's actually 12. So this is now telling you that the beginning of the second round was a disaster for pre-ranks. The end of the second round and the beginning of the third was actually a really good stretch for pre-ranks. John Wall only clouds the system for 5 picks. Chris Middleton only clouds the system for 5 picks. It actually goes up as high as 25 when both Middleton and John Wall are clocked in that last 5. And when they both come out, it drops down as low as 11.5. So from the Devin Booker to Tobias Harris chunk, the pre-ranks are actually really freaking good again, by all accounts. Not perfect, but only a round off. That's pretty good. That's the same as the middle of the second round. And it stays pretty good until you get to Gary Harris. And this is the point that comes up almost any way you look at the numbers this last year. Gary Harris is the no man's land point. I know what you're thinking. You're like, okay, come on. Maybe he and Will Barton were just a couple of outliers in there. Nope. Here's the reason we know that's true. The per 5s right before Gary Harris, it's 14 at Jamal Murray, goes up to 23 by Aaron Gordon, goes up to 28 once Bledsoe and DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge come out of the mix. They were actually sort of artificially bringing the number down. And then at Gary Harris, it jumps from 28 to 50. Sure, it goes back down to 41 for a couple of picks in there. And then at Will Barton, it goes back up to 49. And it never drops below 40 again the rest of the way. And only hits 40 for like 2 or 3 people at a time. However, I shouldn't say the rest of the way. I should say for a long stretch. There's a stretch in there where there's like a low 30s. And then this is the really weird thing. The pre-ranks in the 70s were actually really good, by all accounts. They got a lot closer. They were off by like 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. There was a stretch in there where there was a 70 on the last 5. And then when you get into the actual 70s of pre-ranks, it's hovering in the 20s. But then immediately it jumps back up into the 50s. And by the time you get up near 100, then it's 20, 30, 50, 70, 80, 100, back to 70. That's where the per 5 here, remember we're doing 5s instead of 10s, that's where the per 5 becomes not so useful. Because now you already know you're in no man's land. Knowing that the miss account bounces around that much, all it tells you is what we already know, which is once you get to a certain point, you just pick whatever dude you want. What I think this also tells us is that the fact that the pre-ranks in the 70s were actually relatively close comparatively was a fluke for this year. What are the conclusions we can draw from all of this stuff? Now that we've sort of looked at a lot of the numbers, the overarching conclusion is, and I think Neil actually made a really good point about this last week, it's don't completely abandon everything that we learned by analyzing the numbers over the last 2 or 3 seasons. Looking at the numbers from the 2017-18 and even farther back, the 2016-17 seasons, we basically determined that no man's land fell somewhere in that 70 to 85 range, depending on how good the pre-ranks were. This year, it basically hit at 45. Now, I should add a little caveat, and I will do that in a moment. first thing is the point that Neil made last week that I really want to hammer in is we don't know that this is the new normal. But what you should do with the data we just pulled up from this season is say, okay, we had 2 years where it was like 70, 75, 80, and now we had 1 year where No Man's Land was closer to 45. So maybe we actually, going into this next draft, we'd look at the pre-ranks and say, you know what? There is a possibility that these could go completely off the rails at 45. Not necessarily will, but could. So when you look at the pre-ranks, look at the guys around 50 or 55 and say, do these guys really have the edge over 75 this year? In seasons past, they did. It was a much more linear growth of that per 10, basically. There were a couple of outliers here and there. You pull those out, but the numbers still were sort of steadily increasing. Last couple of years, it was like missed by 2 or 3 in the first round, missed by around 10 in the second and third round, missed by about 15 to 20 in the fourth and fifth, by about 20, 25 in the sixth, and then it was like, poof, 30, 40, back to 30, 20, 50, bounced all over the place, starting around 70. This year, that big old bounce around started at 45. Almost even started at Aaron Gordon, if you want to go a couple picks earlier, or Jamal Murray. Picks were actually really good up until, like, Jamal Murray at 40. There were a couple of good ones mixed in there, but that's where things really started to get messy pretty consistently. You could argue even at 40 instead of 45. So no, you're not going to call No Man's Land 40 next year. 41 is not necessarily No Man's Land. Because here's the thing, and this is the caveat. Yes, the per fives bounce around like crazy. But what is really happening is that there are bigger misses in that 40 and on range. But there are still more hits. Like good hits. Miles Turner ending up as number 25. Al Horford as 27. Mike Conley as 26. Rob Covington as 20. Vooch at 11. Inside the top 60 than there are outside the top 60. Yeah, there's some big hits. Brook Lopez got as high as 32. DeAndre Ayton, 35. Niko Mirotic, 46, although his season took a little bit of a weird turn. But there isn't anybody you draft in the 80s that finished in the 20s. Okay, this is why this is actually a really important point, and I think this is what I want to stress here over the last 5 minutes of this show, is yes, No Man's Land may have started at 46, or what was Gary Harris, 44, or even Jamal Murray at 40 this year, but you still had a better chance of picking a top 25 guy. Okay, you had a zero, you had like a 1% chance. That was Nick Vucevic. He was the only one that made it. Let me amend that number. You still had a much higher chance of picking a top 30 guy if you chose someone pre-ranked in the top 60 with your 40th pick. Again, let's say you have the 40th pick. I guess you'd have 40 and 41, wouldn't you? Doesn't matter. For this hypothetical, you have the 40th pick. You still have a better chance of picking a top 30 guy end of season on a per-game basis if you choose someone inside the top 60 than if you choose someone inside the top 100. Yes, there are stretches in there, like in the 70s, as we mentioned, where the pre-ranks are close by all accounts. They only missed by about 2 rounds instead of average of missing by almost 4 a couple rounds earlier. But here's the thing. Being accurate doesn't mean a better final outcome. That's where you go back to that number, the final average over the last 10 picks. You were wondering when I would work that one in, weren't you? You were like, why does he care about this one? Well, it becomes much more interesting later in the draft when you're comparing the miss size by the actual final ranking. Because miss is one thing. Miss is just telling you, what direction the pre-rank was missing by and how much it was missing by, how accurate the actual pre-rank was. And here's a very simple way to visualize it in your mind. If the 25th pick on average missed by 15 slots, that means you're probably going to get a guy somewhere between 10 and 40. If the 35th pick, on average, missed by only 10, that seems like a better pre-ranking, but your average result is between 25 and 45, which is a lower grouping. I'm putting my hands out in front of my face. You guys can't see this, but it's shifting the barrier. It's shifting the chunk that you actually get, the high and low end. So again, I'll repeat that. If you have the 25th pick, and this is not coming off of my numbers, by the way, I'm just pulling a number out of my hat. If the 25th pick missed on average by 15, that would give you a 10 to 40 window where the guy might end up on average. Again, this is not set in stone. There's, standard deviations and so forth. But for our example, there's a high percentage of a chance that he ends up between 10 and 40. If you have the 35th pick, and let's say, and again, this is not off the numbers, we can go 36th pick. I don't care. The 36th pick, this is off of my numbers now, only missed by, over the last 5, about 12.4. So that's actually a lower number than the last 5 miscount at 25. Okay, keep this in your head. At 25, it was missing by about 16. At 35, it was missing by only 12. But, at 25, a 15 miss gives you 10 to 40. At 35, a 12 miss gives you 23 to 47. That's a lower final ranking, even though the miss distance is less. And that's why we loop back around to the actual final average, not the difference, the actual final ranking over the last 10 picks, which is basically, were these pre-ranks, does the miss distance correspond to where the actual things ended up? So now we look at that chunk there. Remember how I told you the miss distance in the 70s was oddly low? That's great, but it still means that most of the picks in that range finished in the 75 to 100 territory. And remember how I told you that the miss distance in the 40s and 50s was obscenely large? Well, there's still stretches in that territory where the picks finished in the 50s, 70s, mostly in the 70s and 80s. The pre-ranks in the 70s, you still had a lot of that were finishing in the 100 range. Brooke Lopez actually pulled that number way down. All right, this is where we want to compare the two. So, the conclusion to draw there is, even if No Man's Land starts at 40 going forward, let's say that this is the new normal, that doesn't mean with the 40th pick, you should grab the guy pre-ranked 75. The guy pre-ranked 40 still has a better chance to be a top 40 guy than the guy pre-ranked 75. But what it is telling you is that the guy pre-ranked 40 has about the same chance to end up in the top 40 as the guy pre-ranked 50 to 54. So if you really want to make that stretch, that little stretch, you should be okay with it. And then you get into, individual league game theory and stuff like that, where you're trying to figure out who other people in your league are going to pick. That's a topic for about 1,000 podcasts. You almost want to bring every person in your league on the podcast and ask them who they're drafting. I will say, though, and this goes against what I just explained, I will say, if you have the 55th pick, and there's a guy pre-ranked around 80 that you like better, I'm okay with it. Because once you really hit strong No Man's Land where everything is all over the map, then there really is no difference. But what you got in this one was Jamal Murray, Aaron Gordon, Gary Harris, and Will Barton. The 40, 41, 44, and 49 guys that were all just a huge mess. And they screwed up the 40s. They screwed up the 40s because the other guys were actually pretty accurate. It was a round that was clouded. You know, like some rounds, they're just giant misses all over the place. This one was like, Jason Tatum was actually a pretty good pre-rank. Blake Griffin was a good pre-rank. John Collins, Turner, Horford. There were actually 4 or 5 in that group that were really good. Conley was a pretty good pre-rank. I mean, these are misses by like 7 to 20. That's pretty good. Good in the positive or negative direction. And then there were those big whiffs. Gordon, Harris, and Barton in particular. Once you get into the 50s, then it's just all over the place. Between 51 and 60, there's only one that was a less than 15 miss. That was Josh Richardson. He was pre-ranked 56. He finished 67 by average. Every other one was 20 or above, and there was only one, actually, that was in the 20s. So 8 out of the 10 pre-ranks in the 50s were misses by 30 or more. So I would actually argue that No Man's Land started at Ricky Rubio. Or you could say Will Barton if you wanted to, and just call Jason Tatum the outlier instead. So less Gary Harris, more Will Barton. Closer to 50 than 40. I'm putting a little bit of my own opinion on these facts, but you know what? You're stuck with it because I'm doing the podcast. And then it gets a little bit closer again, as I mentioned, for a couple of rounds, and then by pick 83, Brandon Ingram, then the train has not only gone off the rails, but it's smashed into the side of the mountain. Then there's nothing. So there is still kind of like a real goofball No Man's Land that starts at 83, which is closer to where they have in the past. This year, there was just like a 20-pick stretch where it was brutal between 50 and, say, 75. We'll call it like a 25-pick stretch. Then it got a little bit closer again, and then it got really bad again. It's weird. It's really weird. It's quite good through the top 39. Then there's one round where it's half the picks are really good and half are really bad. The 50s and 60s are atrocious. The 50s, really. And then the 70s are good, and then the 80s, 90s, etc. Beyond there, it's just a mess. Complete mess. Although, oddly enough, Luka Doncic at 92 finished at 93. So there's your outlier. That's your anomaly in the 90s. We're finishing this podcast by bouncing all over the map. I'm aware of that, and I'm okay with it. The key, I think, here is trying to figure out how to interpret this data towards further use. Again, I don't think you're totally changing where No Man's Land begins. I think in really digging into the numbers, I would argue that the 50s and 60s might actually be the outliers here, and that most of the time, the 50s and 60s are closer, and so the top 70 to 75 all looks okay, all looks a little more linear. This is a year where it spiked in the 50s and 60s, came back down in the 70s, and then mega spiked in the 80s and beyond. Whereas most years, instead of getting this weird up, down, up curve, you actually just have a line. So don't let this throw us off. The best fit for this year actually does still resemble seasons past, a little bit worse. But we're going to dig into this more. We're going to get into the actual players next time I have a solo pod. We're going to look at how the actual rounds go. We'll go every 10. We'll talk about what that means going forward. That'll be the next Danalytics pod. Thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this one. Really getting into the weeds here on these solo Mondays. Again, tomorrow, back with Neil Rochelani. We'll talk some sports betting with you. Lots to talk about on that front. A lot of fun series going on. Talk about those with Neil on tomorrow's show as well. This is Dan Besbris for Fantasy NBA Today, a Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee presentation. We will talk to you tomorrow. So long.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.